Hi and welcome to week 3 of Introduction to Spanish. This video is going to be a little bit longer because we're combining a few things. I've got a couple students that are falling behind and are trying to make some stuff up. So again, I just wanted to remind you these classes may end up going beyond 8 weeks, but we are going to get through all the information. That's more important to me than trying to keep to a strict 8-week schedule with everybody. We're just making sure we get through everything at a pace that everybody can handle. So we're combining this into 2 videos, so it's going to be a little bit longer, and I'll mention a break time in between in case you need to stop it and then do the rest on a different day. That's fine, but we're going to be going over a couple of concepts in one video. So we're going to be going over verb conjugations in general, AR, ER, and IR. So we're going to learn about the other 2 verb endings, and then we're going to discuss a little bit about how to ask a question, which is obviously something that's very important in Spanish. And we're just going to start talking about it. It's kind of a big concept, and we're going to try to simplify a few things and help you come up with some basic formats. So anyways, if you could pull out your AR, ER, IR verbs intro level sheet from last week. I did reattach it to the email in case you needed it, but if you have it from last week, you can just use that. So we talked about verb conjugations last week. We already reviewed it for AR verbs. I'm just going to jump in right into the ER, IR verbs. So when you have ER verbs, which are regular ER verbs, in order to conjugate them, you do a similar thing to what you do to the AR verbs. You cut off the ER at the end, and you add the appropriate ending. So if you look about halfway down the sheet, we use the verb comer, which means to eat, and that's an ER verb. So yo como means I eat. Tú comes means you eat. Él come means he eats. Nosotros comemos, we eat. Ellos comen, they eat. And then there's some other ones with the subject pronouns there. But those are the appropriate endings. If it's a yo form, you add an O. If it's a tú form, you add an ES. If it's an él, ella, usted form, you add an E. It's a nosotros form, EMOS. And if it's an ellos, ellas, ustedes form, EN. Boom. That's how you handle present tense ER verbs. Now, IR verbs tend to be lumped into the same group because they're conjugated very similarly. In present tense, ER verbs tend to dominate the IR verbs as far as conjugations. So I use the verb vivir, which means to live. So yo vivo means I live, adding an O, taking off the IR, just like we did with the ER verbs. Tú vives. Ella vive. She lives. Nosotros vivimos. We live. Notice the nosotros form. We'll talk about that in a second. It's a little different. And ellas viven. They live. Okay. So the yo form, you add an O. The tú form, ES. The él, ella, usted form, an E, just like you see up above with the ER verbs. In the nosotros form, because it's, well, I won't say it's because it's anything, it keeps the IR form with the IR verb, which, you know, you'll focus more on practicing than memorizing that, because if you say it wrong, it's not the end of the world. Generally, people still understand you. But keep that in mind. Something I usually tell my students is in the nosotros form, because in a lot of the different verb conjugations, past, future, things like that, the nosotros form will actually maintain, it doesn't follow the exact pattern. It will tend to keep its whatever. It doesn't change or doesn't become irregular like other ones sometimes do. And you'll see what I mean when we talk about different verb conjugations. So I usually tell students, we are strong. We will not change. In the we form, it stays the same. So something to think about. So those are your common ER, IR, regular verb conjugations, not including any irregular verbs that we'll talk about at a later date. So we kept it simple. Now let's go to your worksheet. I have a worksheet here. It's very similar to the worksheet I gave you last time, but I threw in some ER and some IR verbs. I tried to keep most of the vocabulary and even the sentences the same, just so you weren't stressing so much about looking stuff up, but just looking at the concepts of conjugating. So I want you to go through this verb, the list of sentences right here, and I would like you to conjugate the verb that's in parentheses. You may want to stop and look up the verb first to see what it means, but then conjugate it according to the subject pronoun that you see on the left. The first one, nosotros compramos los periódicos, is we buy the newspapers, the periodicals. Comprar means to buy. So I'm going to read through the sentences just so you can hear them, and then if you want to repeat them after you finish it, you can. I'm going to try to do this a little bit more so you get a little bit more listening and repetition in if you get a chance while you're watching the video. So I'm just going to read through the sentences starting with number 2. I will conjugate the verb as it is there. You'll still have to write it down and you can follow along with me or just conjugate it after the fact, but just so you can listen through and practice the pronunciation. Number 2, ellas escriben muy bien. Number 3, nosotros vendemos la ropa. Number 4, ustedes necesitan más tiempo. Number 5, ella recibe cartas de sus amigas. Number 6, los estudiantes imprimen los formularios. Number 7, muchas personas viven por aquí. Number 8, ella come tacos. And number 9, nosotros no prendemos la radio. So there's a few conjugations. Again, you can go through and conjugate them after the fact. However you want to handle it is fine. But once you get it done, if you do it after the fact, maybe go back through and watch this short section of the video just to pronounce them as you're going through. That will help, because listening to the endings and what they sound like will help, as opposed to trying to memorize lists, because they're close to 12 different verb conjugations between future, present, past, everything. Learning how the sounds go versus memorizing a set list in the long run will be a little bit easier, than because your brain will be able to react faster to sound versus trying to formulate which one you need to use. So just keep that in mind. Repetition will help over trying to memorize a list and using it in context. So there's some verb conjugations to look at. We're still in the present tense, just looking at some different verb conjugations. So this would be a good break point. We're going to stop and move into the next section. We've already talked about conjugation, so we don't need to go into it a ton. We just wanted to look at how to use them with other ones. With the ER-IR verbs. The next section we're going to talk about will take a little bit longer because we're going to talk about questions. So we'll jump into that now. So how do you ask a question? If you've got your worksheet out and your regular info sheet, how do you ask a question? Today that's what we're going to look at. And there's 3 main points that you want to keep in mind when you ask a question that I consider to be really important. There's other parts to it, but just kind of the basics. First of all, questions in Spanish can use interrogative words. Who, what, when, where, why, and how, just like we have in English. So we have here, I put a list of the more common one, well, I'd say a pretty complete list of what you're going to be using. So we'll start with the first one. ¿Quién is who? Or ¿quién es if there's more than one, like who's, like from multiple people. Whose is this? If you have multiple people that you're asking about. ¿De quién? From who? So I put an example. ¿Quién es ella? Who is she? The next one, ¿qué? Means what. An example, ¿qué hora es? What time or what hour is it? ¿Cuándo? The next one means when. ¿Cuándo es la fiesta? When is the party? ¿Dónde? Means where. ¿A dónde? To where. ¿De dónde? From where. An example, ¿dónde estás? Where are you? ¿Dónde está anything? Where is something? ¿Dónde está el baño? Everybody learns that one. Where's the bathroom? ¿Dónde está el baño? ¿Por qué? Means why. The word por qué, when you push it together and take off the accent mark, means because in the middle of a sentence. Confusing, right? You could literally have a conversation. ¿Por qué? Which means why. ¿Por qué? Because. So, ¿por qué caminas tanto? Why do you walk so much? For what do you walk so much is what they're getting at with por qué. ¿Cómo? Means how. ¿Cómo se llama usted? How do you call yourself? ¿Cómo estás? How are you? Another common one we looked at with greetings. ¿Cuánto? ¿Cuántos? ¿Cuánta? ¿Cuántas? This one is affected by gender and by masculinity, femininity. So it's how much or how many. ¿Cuánto es, for example, how much is it? You're talking about one simple thing, talking about how much something costs maybe. Even ¿cuánto es? How much does it cost? How much is it? ¿Cuántos casos tienes? How many cases do you have? So when it becomes plural, in this case, casos is masculine, then you'd leave the OS on there. Then you have to change it. ¿Cuántos casos tienes? Now, notice that tienes has an S at the end. That has nothing to do with the plurality. It actually has to do with who you're talking to. That's just a verb. That's an irregular verb, but it's in the to form. So if you notice on your ER verb conjugations we already talked about, That's what the ending looks like, so it has nothing to do with that. Just wanted to point that out. How many cases do you have? So you could ask that with anything. ¿Cuántos libros tienes? How many books do you have? Anything like that. So, number 2. When placing a question in Spanish without using the interrogative words, like, do you run every day? The do does not exist. Same thing with don't. It just doesn't exist in this context. There is a verb for to do or to make. The verb is hacer, but it's used only when we say, like, I do yoga or I do exercises, not do you like or do you do anything like that. The question in Spanish, so that's when you say the question in Spanish, for example, do you run every day, comes out sounding like you run every day, which you can kind of do in English with a little bit of voice inflection, but in Spanish that word do just doesn't exist. ¿Hablas español? Do you speak Spanish? The whole do you speak gets eaten up in the hablas. ¿Hablas español? Sometimes they'll add the subject pronoun after the verb instead of placing it before to make it a question, which implies a question, which kind of sounds old school in English. I'll show you in a second. ¿Sabe usted la hora? Which you're trying to say, do you know the time? But literally they're saying, know you the time? So I put a little picture there to help you remind you the word do just in this context does not exist in Spanish. So we've talked about interrogative words. They just get connected with any type of, you'll notice any type of noun or any type of verb in Spanish. Some of the verbs you've already talked about. We talked about when you place them, how to do the order. Sometimes you reverse the order and put the subject pronoun after instead of putting it before. Things like that. But the word do doesn't exist. Third, and this is just a very simple little thing, as a result of this in Spanish, because voice inflection is so important, they will sometimes put the upside down question mark at the beginning. I apologize, not sometimes, always. Sometimes it can be in the middle of a sentence. So that upside down question mark is the signal for you to raise your voice and change it into more of a question form instead of just making it a statement, which is why that upside down question mark is so important. So at the beginning of any question sentence, you will see an upside down question mark. Period. So those are the 3 main points that you want to think about when asking questions. Now, so we're going to see some examples of questions, and you're going to start working on it. We kind of got the basics out. So you got your who, what, when, where, why, and how. If you're asking a question where you're not using one of those, you just make a statement. So, that's a rule, something to look at, but really doesn't change what you have to do with it. You just have to add an upside down question mark, and all of a sudden you have a question. And with anything else beyond the interrogative words. So now I'd like you to try your worksheet and see if you can go through that. I have a worksheet here that goes through, has some questions in Spanish, and I'd like you to bust out your dictionary, use the info sheet, use the video, this video, and try to figure out what these are saying in English. So it's a simple into English translation. You're going to use your dictionary. I guarantee you're going to have to look up some of these terms, but I want you to start thinking in reverse order. It's not just a matter of, let me look it up real quick and get it done. Just take just a minute after you get done and realize what some of these things are in English versus Spanish, because they don't literally translate all the time. So I'm going to go through and read them in Spanish, again, just so you can practice the pronunciation and listen to it, and you can take it from there with finishing up your worksheet. So I'll start with number 1 and just work my way down. ¿Dónde está el archivo? ¿Por qué corre ella en la mañana? ¿Bailas? ¿Quién lava la ropa? ¿Come usted tacos? ¿Cómo están ustedes? ¿Cuándo es la fiesta? ¿A qué hora es la cita? So those are your sentences. Try to figure out what they mean in English. Maybe come back to the video, rewind it 30-40 seconds, and listen to them again looking at what they say in English. Would be great practice. Just take a few minutes. So that is it for this week. We're shortening up a little bit, again, because we have students kind of falling behind. So feel free to email me if you have any questions, and keep listening to your weekly CDs in the car as best you can. They may, try to keep in mind that the videos I post for week 3 versus week 4 tend to match up with the appropriate ones that I in the first email that I give you for the week. So just keep that in mind. You can always go back and listen to some of the first ones again, especially with the vocabulary builders. That's a great idea. So other than that, I will see you next week. Happy weekend.